Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video number 240, Long-Term Chaos Ritualism. Chaosmagic, of course, less directional, more experimentational. That's basically what I've been doing with my literature this last half-decade, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that. With my literature, when I'm editing or writing or something, first, there are two different facets of magic that go into my literature. The first is that the only reason I began writing in the first place, which leads right into my editing, they're totally intertwined, was because I had a weird dream many years ago when I was still in high school, actually. I had a dream I was in a dimly lit sort of place. It was like a Kmart or something, but it was like post-apocalyptic or whatever. Most of the lights weren't working. It was all stuff all over the aisles. Some of the aisles had collapsed. And I found like this little wooden box in my dream in the back of one of these little dimly lit areas, and it had like dried fruit in it, and I was eating that. It was like dried peaches or apricots or some shit. And then underneath the fruit there was actually a withered, dehydrated fetus, and I began eating that too, and I felt inspired spiritually by this. Then there was a second dream sequence right after this where I was clinging to the side of a cliff digging out bones and looking at Jane Goodall, and she was hanging out with like a chimpanzee over on the side. It was like this huge cliff, and it came into a prominence, and there was this round sort of almost UFO looking structure there, and I guess that was her lab or whatever. That didn't last as long and didn't leave me spiritually inspired. That was just interesting. But as soon as that had happened, I started writing the preliminary material that later would become Sickness and Hell. The initial plot was totally different. I've thought about going and revisiting the original material. I actually destroyed the original manuscript because it got too meandering. It didn't make sense. Initially, it was going to be a little bit more of a standard horror thriller as opposed to being splatterpunk grotesquerie. I'll go back and revisit at some point. I also have to redo Sickness and Hell because there are a few problems with the manuscript, a few spelling errors people have pointed out, and it's in the wrong font. The storyline I like, but it's not complete. Morbid stories began to exist because of this. Basically, I started writing about that stuff in AP English in 12th grade and passing in little sections of what would become morbid stories in Sickness and Hell as work for credit. I think I always got a 10 out of 10 on them too, but it was pretty crazy. Basically, I was trying to piss off the English teacher because she had a thing about to-be verbs. She wanted you to always use the active tense, and so you weren't allowed to use certain words, and it was like, an exercise in failure, and it was like really crazy. So I started making things extremely hyperbolic and just having nothing but action, and so I just tried to make it as grotesque as possible, and it was considered funny. I think they were a little bit worried towards the end of the year. I think they were worried I was going to become like a serial killer or something. I think concerns were brought up at like the next meeting with my parents, but it's pretty fun. And I graduate, so nobody gives a shit. Look at me now, Mom. Really funny. But anyway, at that point, essentially my occult side starts to come out around that same time. Some people would think it's like, well, you lost your Christian faith when you went to college because of commies. Look at my political views. I don't think that's really a problem. I've never been anything other than a standard liberal. Of course, that means I'm supposedly far right nowadays because I'm a progressive. It's really very funny to see that happen. My views didn't change. Culture's views changed very, very quickly, very frenetically, in a very, very insane manner. But for the last 5 years that I've been editing, there's been additional sort of overlap. It's sort of like a long-term occult experiment. Now, I've spoken about the fact that I feel demonically inspired to do the editing projects that I'm doing. But there's an experimentation that even goes beyond that when I'm looking for works to cover, when I'm skimming through them, when I actually begin editing them. I find that quite often, to a non-coincidental degree, quite often things jump out at me in the texts that I'm editing. Like as soon as I'm done with this video, once I begin sharing things out, I settle in, I do my next 20, 30 pages of editing on the work that I'm on. I fully expect that through the course of editing this text, and this is a full-length one, very good one, Evil Eye and Thanatology, excellent work so far. It's basically a series of lectures, some of which are not occult in nature, but the Evil Eye is obviously a spiritual topic, among other things contained therein. Some of it's historical, still very occult in nature. History and the occult are basically intertwined. I fully expect that through the course of it, things will jump out at me from the text that remind me of the last few that I've edited. And this has happened time and time again. The fact is that some of these things aren't even close in relation insofar as the subtopics that they're covering. A work about theosophy that talks about clairvoyance shouldn't have a huge amount of overlap with a considerably older herbal work. There shouldn't be a significant degree of overlap, and yet concepts, sometimes even names used, proper names of people that are being discussed, jump out at me, and they're very similar or even identical. Some of the points made in some cases are identical. In some cases it's plagiarism, with some of the fortune-telling works very common. But there's no real reason why I should see so many connections between these things. I think that, some people might say, well, the average person maybe just doesn't see the connections as often, or doesn't plow through a bunch of works that are roughly under the same occult header. Okay, it still boggles the mind how often this happens, when technically these works aren't related. Just because they're both occult doesn't mean they have anything particular in common. A work of divination that's talking about the zodiac, or an oracle, or dream interpretation, having anything to do with a 200-year-old work on alchemical history, it doesn't even make really that much sense. They're not really about the same subject. But it's definitely chaos magic that I'm doing because I'm not going anywhere in particular. It's like in standard sort of ritual form, in standard occult form, you're trying to accomplish a goal, and then you're doing things setting about to do so. On the chaotic side of the occult, not necessarily chaos magic purely speaking, but on that side of the occult, you're simply doing, you don't really have a goal, and you're being led by something otherworldly. I find it comforting. I find it quite happy. I have a great time. And editing, yeah, I'm never going to stop. My next goal is to hit 300 works by the end of next year, which I know is doable at the rate that I edit. And I will. That's my next goal. After that, I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to see where my work takes me. It's not like I can ever possibly exhaust the number of titles that are out there that would be edited, and as potentially I refine my system more and more, maybe other works become accessible. Like one thing that I really hate is when things have a lot of footnotes. Oh my god, I fucking hate works like that. Because I have to go through individually and either create that second section, which can mess with the margins and format, trust me. I have to either create that second section and try to do it right so that I don't have to restart the work halfway through and spend an entire day reformatting everything, or I have to take each one of those mentions and put it in like an appendix or something. I tend to want to do the latter. I much prefer an appendix as opposed to having a bunch of bullshit in the text itself, interrupting me on every fucking page. But yeah, there's a little bit about long-term chaos ritualism. A little bit meandering here, but it's always good to have a good rant. That's about all. Peace out.